We used to have a lot of handheld Star Wars games back on the era of the PSP and DS. LEGO Star Wars 1 and 2, The Force Unleashed, Battlefront 2, the list goes on. Since then, we haven't really gotten that much outside of the Switch version of Star Wars Pinball. The last Nintendo Direct, though, had a bit of a surprise when not only a Star Wars game was coming to the Switch, but a Star Wars first-person shooting game from the Jedi Knight series. So let's talk about this Star Wars shooter that uses the old Quake 3 Arena engine. Here is my review of Star Wars Jedi Knight 2 Jedi Outcast for the Nintendo Switch. Jedi Outcast takes place after Return of the Jedi, and since this game was made before the merger of Disney and Lucasfilms, this unfortunately is now a non-canon Legends story. The plot revolves around Kyle Katarn, a Jedi who nearly fell to the dark side and broke himself off from the Force because of it. While taking on mercenary work into experiments involving crystals, his partner is taken hostage and killed by a fallen Jedi. In response to this, Kyle goes on a quest to rediscover the Force and take down this fallen Jedi. Overall, I think the story of Jedi Outcast is okay. It's not great, but it's okay. It's got mildly interesting character arcs and really plays on nostalgia with the return of Luke Skywalker and Lando Calrissian, the latter being voiced by none other than Billy D. Williams himself. When it comes to gameplay, this is a shooting game that can alternate between first-person and third-person modes, kind of like the old Battlefront games. It's made in the Quake 3 Arena engine, so any old fan of id Software should be pretty familiar with how this game plays. First, let's talk about the differences between this new version of Jedi Outcast for PS4 and Nintendo Switch and the original. In terms of game modes, all of the single-player content is here, but the multiplayer modes have been completely removed. And unlike games like Turok 2, this wasn't just for the Switch version. PS4 players also do not have access to the game's multiplayer features. Outside of that, everything is here, including the special cheat menu letting you enable God mode, get all weapons from the start, or warp to whatever level you want. You just gotta know how to open it up by going into the pause menu, hitting up, down, left stick press, right stick press, and left stick press, and you'll be good to go. When it comes to progression, this game is about shooting and exploration like a lot of old games that used id Software's engines. Every level is very large, kind of like a maze with a lot of switches to press, secret areas littered around, and enemies to take down and drop keys so you can open doors to get to where you need to go. It's not really a very linear game. Every level is about exploring, learning the map, and then figuring out what you need to do and where you need to do it. Now in terms of combat, the game starts out like a typical FPS where you're fighting enemies with firearms, platforming around, and collecting ammo and keys from fallen enemies. But when you get to levels 4 and 5, you add a lightsaber to your arsenal as well as force powers like force push and force speed. This gives you a lot of different things you can do. You can run around in first person mode shooting down people with firearms, or you could swap over to your lightsaber and the game pretty much changes from a first person shooting game into a third person hack and slash action game. And even beyond that, each weapon you get is unique because it has 2 different kinds of attacks instead of just one. The basic blaster pistol can fire off bolts like normal, or you can hold down the ZL button to charge 5 bolts into one large charge shot. Every single weapon in the game has this 2 type of attack capability all the way down to the thermal detonators that you can toss like grenades. Now the actual combat and shooting is a lot of fun, but it's also a bit weird and has to be adjusted to for a couple reasons. It's very difficult to aim properly regardless of your sensitivity settings, and the laser blasts act kind of like projectiles rather than instant shots, giving you an odd feeling and having to adjust your timing of when to attack and when not to attack. The save system is also a bit of an awkward thing. The game kind of auto-saves with checkpoints, but those checkpoints are pretty much always the very beginning of the level, so it's important that you do manual saves so you don't lose progress, and manual saves is another odd thing. Every time you make a save, it uses up a new slot, and you've only got 5 slots. So by the time I got through the second or third stage, I was already out of save slots, constantly going in and manually deleting save files so I could save and quit the game. Now let's get onto a brighter note with content and length. The game only costs $9, and across exploring and learning each map, you'll likely be spending at least 10 to 12 hours on the game from start to finish. In other words, it's the same price as the Steam version and you're getting a lot of bang for your buck. Now let's dive into controls so we can talk about the aiming. Jedi Outcast console version added gyro aiming, which makes it a lot easier to aim, but the aiming system of the game is still very weird and wonky. Even when you edit the sensitivity settings, it's very hard to aim precisely because it constantly jerks around when you're trying to move the camera. Now let's dive into presentation. Graphically, I think the game looks fine. All of the models are very smooth, so you won't be seeing any jagged edges, and it looks pretty much the same as it did on PC and other systems. Now performance is pretty good for the most part, but the frame rate does dip down from its normal 60 frames per second in a few areas. One example is the fact that it drops down under 30 frames per second outside the mines in the game's third level. And with that out of the way, let's get into battery life, which is pretty good across all models. On the original model, it has a battery range of 4 hours and 12 minutes up to 5 hours and 46 minutes. On the Nintendo Switch Lite, it has a range of 4 hours and 51 minutes up to 6 hours and 30 minutes. And finally, on the V2 or Red Box, it's got a battery range of 6 hours and 27 minutes up to 8 hours and 24 minutes. Now in conclusion, Jedi Outcast isn't a bad introduction to Star Wars to the Switch community, at least outside of Star Wars Pinball. Now on the downside, there are no multiplayer modes, and the aiming and save frustrations of the original game are still present even with the added gyro aiming support. But if you're willing to deal with a little jerky aiming or just popping in the cheat menu to help you along, this is a decent first-person shooter in the Star Wars franchise. Reviews to go rate Star Wars Jedi Knight 2 for the Nintendo Switch a 6.5 out of 10. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. Thanks for watching and have a great day.